Going on to other community media, starting with television, there is a certain amount of local television. Does community radio actually offer a real competition? Does it do anything particularly differently or better than those television stations do?
It's an interesting question, that one. I would argue whether BBC does local. I would actually say it's not very good at doing local, and that's both in television and radio. And I can give you an example. We're based in Sheffield, and the BBC television stuff comes from Leeds, which is 40 miles away. Sheffield's the 5th largest city in the UK, is mentioned about once a fortnight on the BBC local news, so I would very much debate whether it was local in the first place. So what community media does and community television would do, along with community radio, is it brings a much more local element to it. And community TV is quite interesting at this point in time. It's a very pertinent point in time, as the new government and the new minister, Jeremy Hunt, is very much in favour of local television, and so we have a real opportunity to actually expand the local TV offering in the UK. And when people talk about local TV or local radio, they tend to think of news. But the reality is that news is only a very small part, A, of what a community radio station does, and B, of what a community television station does, or any television station except, News 24. Fine, that's news, that's what it is. But no other broadcaster does, news in that sort of way. It's hugely a part of their offering. And so what local TV does is say, this is the arts group, this was their performance, this is what's happening in the local schools, this is what's happening with the local council. Very much about democracy, as is community radio, obviously. And when I say community media, I'm talking about both. Very much about holding people to account, about informing their listeners and their viewers as to what's actually going on in their city or their town or their region.
How viable is it really? And is it...
Viability of local television. There are some people who say it can't possibly be viable since ITV is not, but we would argue that ITV is not because it's too big. So we talked about BBC News recently. Well, ITV is just the same. It's an artificial region created for the sake of getting advertising revenue. We would argue that local television can survive and can succeed because there are a number of local advertisers out there who don't advertise on ITV because it's way too expensive, who'd be quite happy, for example, to say, we're based in Sheffield, come down to our local store in the city centre. That kind of advertising very rarely reaches either radio or TV. So although we obviously advocate not-for-profit models for community media, we can see that there'd be quite a mixed ecology in terms of income for community TV, as there is for community radio, some of which would be advertising, some of which might be service level agreements, very, very much like the model for community radio actually. Whether the new government will go for that is another matter.
Is it entirely up to the government then, depending on kind of policy for television and radio?
Broadcasting policy is made by whatever government is in power, and even the nations have not got devolved broadcasting powers. So broadcasting is very much a central Westminster government issue.
Is there anything you've come up against? What about the changes since this new government's come in? Is it benefited you, or is there anything that's kind of hugely affected the community media sector?
We've been lobbying, campaigning for a long, long time to get true, hopefully, community television, but local TV across the UK. And we're not talking the whole of Buckinghamshire. We're talking Aylesbury TV. It's that kind of local TV. So that's a huge boost, but there's an awful lot of work to do. There's no question. The big broadcasters don't see it as a threat yet. So I think there's a lot of work to do, particularly with the government, to sort of say this is the shape for media for the next 20 years in the UK, for the citizens, for people, not for the people who want to make lots of money out of it.
Because it's a volunteer-based, sector, does that actually affect you in any real way, or is it kind of...
I think that the community media sector is the big society in action, quite frankly. The thing about the big society agenda from the government is there is no money in it, we are told. Although we'll have to see. Again, that's something we are working quite hard with the government on, to make sure that community media is recognised as one of the deliverers on the big society agenda. And that's both encouraging people into volunteering, helping them move on with skills and their interests, getting their messages out, being able to tell their own stories their own ways. So our sector is very much located in the big society agenda. Whether the big society agenda is something we can completely agree with is another matter, in that volunteers need looking after. There's a kind of notion within the big society agenda that somehow will take away all the paid-for public services and people will just step in and run their own libraries. The reality is that's not going to happen.
And what about going back to the different sectors, what about the community newspaper and magazine sector? That must have changed quite a lot in the last kind of 10 years or so.
We have very, very few members who are actually community newsletter providers, although we do very much see them as part of our sector. It's just doing the same thing in a different way. As I say, we don't really mind about the medium. It's about the fact that it's for the community, by the community, for the community, and. So that's the really important element about it. But we do think they should be members of the CMA, quite frankly. But, it has changed, and obviously things are going more and more online.
How do all three sectors use the internet? I mean, is it different for each one? Do your radio stations broadcast over the internet? Do your television stations?
A lot of them didn't used to, but things are changing, and they're changing fast. So almost all the community radio stations also stream live online, do podcasting. They're increasingly making use of social media, which is good. And for us, like all the media converge. So somebody might start out saying we're a community radio station, but they'll have a website that's interactive. They'll be on Facebook and Twitter. They will have video on their websites. A lot of them are doing video and radio training. If you take it the other way around, community television operators are obviously producing video. They're also streaming live on the net. A number of radio stations will say, the number of listeners they have online is more than the local BBC stations. So online is a huge part of what they do. But they must never forget their remit, no matter whether it's whatever the medium, whether it's TV or radio, is to the local community first and foremost. So when people kind of go, we've got 100 million listeners online, you go, yeah, but how many of them are actually in your local community? That's the really important bit.